The stagecoach lurched violently over another rut in the dusty Wyoming road, and Jane Garrett grabbed the leather strap beside her window to keep from being thrown into the lap of the sleeping man across from her. She pressed her hand against the pocket of her traveling dress, feeling the crinkle of letters beneath the fabric, and wondered for the 100th time if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. The letters had arrived in Boston over the course of 6 months, each one signed by Harold Peterson, a successful merchant in Laramie who claimed he needed a wife and had the means to support one comfortably. The words had been proper, respectful, and utterly devoid of anything resembling passion or warmth. Yet here she was, 22 years old and traveling 2,000 miles to marry a complete stranger because her options back east had narrowed to nothing after her father's business failed and left the family destitute. The landscape outside had transformed dramatically over the past few days. Gone were the green hills and tidy farms of the Eastern Territories. Now the land stretched endlessly in waves of golden grass beneath a sky so vast it made her feel small and insignificant. Mountains rose in the distance like sleeping giants, their peaks still dusted with snow despite it being late May of 1882. She had read about the West in newspapers and dime novels, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer enormity of it all, or the way the wind seemed to carry a wildness that made her heart beat faster with equal parts fear and exhilaration. The stage-coach driver, a grizzled man named Murphy who smelled of tobacco and sweat, had told her that morning they would reach Laramie by evening. That gave her perhaps 6 more hours to prepare herself for meeting Harold Peterson in person. She pulled one of his letters from her pocket and read it again, studying the careful penmanship. He had described himself as 45 years old, a widower with no children, owner of the largest general store in Laramie. He promised her a comfortable home, respect, and stability. He had not promised love, and she had not expected it. Love seemed like a luxury reserved for people who had choices. The sleeping passenger across from her snorted and shifted, and Jane returned the letter to her pocket. She smoothed her traveling dress, which had once been a rich burgundy but had faded to a dusty rose after too many washings. Her mother had helped her pack what few decent clothes remained after they had sold everything of value. The trunk strapped to the top of the stagecoach contained 2 other dresses, undergarments, a worn copy of Jane Eyre, her mother's pearl earrings, and a small silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother. Everything she owned in the world could fit in one modest trunk, and the thought made her throat tighten with emotion she refused to let show on her face. The stagecoach suddenly lurched to a stop, throwing Jane forward hard enough that she had to brace both hands against the opposite seat. The sleeping passenger jerked awake with a curse, and outside she heard Murphy shouting something she could not quite make out. Her heart hammered in her chest as she leaned toward the window. Had they been attacked by bandits? She had heard stories of stagecoach robberies, of passengers stripped of their valuables or worse, but the scene outside was not what she expected. A horse stood in the middle of the road, a magnificent chestnut animal with a white blaze down its face, and it appeared to be limping badly. No rider was visible anywhere nearby, and the landscape offered little cover apart from scattered sagebrush and a few weathered rock formations in the distance. Murphy climbed down from his perch, his boots raising small clouds of dust when they hit the ground. He approached the horse slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. Jane watched through the window, fascinated despite her nervousness. The horse allowed Murphy to get close, and that was when she saw the blood on its foreleg and the saddle hanging loose on its side. "Something happened to the rider," the male passenger muttered, now fully awake and peering out his own window. That horse has been running hard. A cold feeling settled in Jane's stomach. She scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of movement. The endless grassland suddenly seemed ominous rather than beautiful, full of hidden dangers she could not begin to imagine. Back in Boston, danger meant pickpockets in crowded markets or occasionally aggressive drunks outside taverns. Here, danger felt primeval and vast, as limitless as the sky above. Murphy led the limping horse to the side of the road and began examining its leg more closely. Jane could see him shaking his head. The other passenger, a portly man in a rumpled suit who had introduced himself as a whiskey salesman at the start of the journey, opened the door and climbed out. After a moment's hesitation, Jane followed. Her legs felt stiff from hours of sitting, and the wind immediately whipped at her skirts and tried to pull pins from her carefully arranged hair. The horse threw a shoe and tore up its leg pretty bad, Murphy was saying to the salesman. But what worries me more is where the rider is. This is good tack, well maintained. Whoever owns this animal knows what they are doing, and no experienced rider would let their horse get in this condition unless something went seriously wrong. Should we search for him? The salesman asked, though his tone suggested he hoped the answer would be no. Murphy squinted at the sun, which had begun its descent toward the western horizon. We are already running behind schedule. If we do not make Laramie by nightfall, we will have to camp on the open plain, and I do not fancy that with a lady aboard and only one rifle between us. He glanced at Jane apologetically. Besides, we do not know which direction the rider went or how far. Could be miles in any direction by now. Jane stepped closer to the horse, which turned its large, liquid eyes toward her. The animal was breathing hard, its coat dark with sweat, and she felt a surge of sympathy. We cannot just leave it here, she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. It will die. Murphy looked at her with something that might have been respect. You are right about that, miss, but we cannot take it with us either. Stagecoach horses have all they can handle pulling the coach and passengers. Adding another animal would slow us down considerably. As if in response to their dilemma, a figure appeared on the horizon, walking toward them with the steady gait of someone accustomed to covering long distances on foot. All three of them turned to look, and Murphy's hand dropped to the rifle he carried. As the figure drew closer, Jane could make out more details. It was a man, tall and lean, wearing a dusty brown hat pulled low over his face. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his left side, and carried a saddle over one shoulder with apparent ease despite the injury. That'll be the horse's owner, I'd wager, Murphy said, though he kept his hand on the rifle until the man got close enough for them to see he wore no gun belt. The stranger looked to be in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly where it brushed his collar. His face was lean and angular, marked with a few days' worth of stubble, and his eyes were an unusual shade of gray-green that reminded Jane of the ocean just before a storm. Those eyes swept over the three of them, lingering for just a moment on Jane before focusing on Murphy. That your horse? Murphy asked, still cautious. Yes, sir, the man replied, and his voice was deep and pleasant despite the obvious fatigue in his posture. Name is Thomas Sullivan. I am a ranch hand at the Double Creek Ranch about 15 miles northwest of here. Was riding to Laramie when my horse stepped in a prairie dog hole and went down hard. I tried to keep up with him on foot, but he spooked and ran. Been tracking him for the better part of 3 hours now. He dropped the saddle on the ground with a thud and approached his horse slowly, running his hands over the animal's neck and speaking in low tones that Jane could not quite hear. The affection between man and animal was immediately apparent, and she felt herself relax slightly. Whatever else this Thomas Sullivan might be, he clearly cared about his horse. "Your horse is in bad shape," Murphy said bluntly. "Torn up its leg pretty good. It is not going to be carrying you anywhere for a while." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I can see that. I will walk him back to the ranch. It will take most of the night, but I cannot leave him out here." He paused, then looked at Murphy with an expression that suggested he was swallowing considerable pride. "I do not suppose you have any water to spare." "Lost my canteen when the horse went down, and I have not had a drink in several hours." Murphy hesitated only briefly before pulling out his own canteen and handing it over. Thomas drank deeply, careful not to waste a drop, then used a small amount to wet a handkerchief and clean the blood from his horse's leg. Jane found herself watching his movements, which were efficient and gentle at the same time. His hands were calloused and strong, the hands of someone who worked hard for a living, but they touched the injured animal with a tenderness that made something in her chest tighten unexpectedly. "We can take you as far as Laramie," Murphy offered. "It is only about another 20 miles, and you can arrange transport from there back to your ranch. Your horse needs more attention than you can give it out here anyway. Doc Henderson in town has some veterinary skills." Thomas looked torn, glancing between his horse and the stagecoach. "I appreciate the offer, but I do not have money for passage right now. Just got paid yesterday, and it is all back at the ranch." "Consider it a courtesy," Murphy said gruffly. "Cannot leave a man stranded out here, money or no money. You can settle up with the company later if you are determined." After a moment, Thomas nodded. "Thank you. I accept." He fashioned a rough lead from some rope in his saddlebag and tied it loosely to the back of the stagecoach. The horse would be able to follow at its own pace, and the slow speed of the stagecoach would prevent further injury. As they all climbed back into the coach, Jane found herself seated next to Thomas while the whiskey salesman reclaimed his spot across from them. In the confined space, she was acutely aware of Thomas's presence beside her. He smelled of horse and leather and something else, something clean and masculine that made her pulse quicken in a way that felt dangerously inappropriate. She was traveling to marry another man. She had no business noticing how broad Thomas's shoulders were, or the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, when Murphy made a dry comment about the reliability of horses versus the reliability of women. The stagecoach lurched back into motion, and Thomas leaned back against the seat with a soft exhale that might have been relief or pain. Jane tried to focus on the landscape passing outside her window, but her attention kept drifting back to the man beside her. She could see a dark stain spreading on his shirt just above his left hip and realized he was bleeding. "You are injured," she said, the words coming out before she could think better of them. Thomas glanced down at his side with a frown. "Just scraped up from when the horse went down." "Nothing serious." "It is bleeding," Jane insisted. "You should let me look at it." He gave her a startled look as if surprised that she would care. "I do not want to trouble you, miss." "It is no trouble," she replied firmly. "And if you let it become infected out of stubbornness, that will be trouble for everyone." She had spent 2 years helping at a charitable hospital in Boston after her father's business failed, learning basic nursing skills that had proven useful when money was too tight to call a doctor for every minor ailment. The work had been grueling and often heartbreaking, but it had given her a sense of purpose she had not found anywhere else. Thomas looked at Murphy and the whiskey salesman as if seeking masculine support for refusing her help, but both men just shrugged. With obvious reluctance, he began unbuttoning his shirt. Jane felt heat rise in her cheeks at the impropriety of the situation, but she forced herself to maintain a clinical demeanor. When he pulled the fabric aside, She could see a nasty scrape running from his ribs down to his hip, crusted with dirt and blood. "I need water and something clean to use as a bandage," she said to Murphy, who passed back his canteen and a surprisingly clean handkerchief. Jane wet the cloth and began carefully cleaning the wound. Thomas hissed softly at the first touch, but otherwise remained still, his jaw set. Up close like this, she could see that his eyes were more green than gray, and they watched her face with an intensity that made her hands tremble slightly. "You have done this before," he observed, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the rattle of the stagecoach wheels. "I worked in a hospital in Boston for a while," she replied, keeping her own voice equally quiet. "This is nothing compared to some of the injuries I saw there." "Boston," he repeated, and something in his tone made her look up at him. "Long way from home. What brings you to Wyoming?" Jane hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding the truth. He would find out soon enough when they reached Laramie. "I am traveling to marry someone. A merchant named Harold Peterson. We have been corresponding, and he has offered to make me his wife." Something flickered across Thomas's face, an expression she could not quite read. "Mail order bride," he said, and there was no judgment in his tone, only a kind of sadness. "Must be hard, leaving everything you know to marry a stranger." "Harder than staying where I was," Jane admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. She finished cleaning the wound and used strips torn from one of Murphy's spare handkerchiefs to create a makeshift bandage. Her fingers brushed against the bare skin of his side, and she felt him tense at the contact. "My family lost everything. This was the best option available to me." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching her secure the bandage with neat, efficient movements. When she finished and sat back, he slowly buttoned his shirt again. "Thank you," he said simply. "You did not have to help me." "Yes, I did," Jane replied. "It would have been wrong not to." The whiskey salesman across from them had been watching the entire exchange with open curiosity. "This Harold Peterson," he said suddenly. "I know him, bought whiskey from him just last month on my rounds. He runs a good business, keeps a clean store." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "He is not an easy man, though, particular about things, likes everything just so." Jane felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "What do you mean?" The salesman shifted in his seat. "Just that he has high expectations. His first wife she passed about 3 years back from fever. Heard he was pretty cut up about it. Maybe he has softened since then, though. Man can change after losing someone." Thomas made a soft sound that might have been disagreement, and when Jane looked at him, she found him staring out the window with an expression that had gone carefully neutral. She wanted to ask him what he was thinking, but the question felt too intimate for someone she had just met. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and tried to focus on the fact that in just a few hours, she would be meeting her future husband. The sun sank lower as they traveled, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink that seemed to set the entire prairie on fire. Jane had never seen such dramatic sunsets in Boston, where buildings blocked much of the horizon. Here there was nothing to stop the eye from following the land to its edge, nothing to diminish the raw beauty of the landscape. Despite her anxiety about what awaited her in Laramie, she felt a stirring of something that might have been hope. Perhaps she could build a life here. Perhaps there was more possibility in this wild, open country than there had ever been in the narrow confines of her old world. "First time out west?" Thomas asked quietly, and she realized he had been watching her watch the sunset. "Yes," she admitted. "It is very different from what I am used to." "More beautiful than I expected, but more frightening too," he nodded slowly. "It takes some adjusting. The space, the silence, the way you can see for miles but still feel isolated. But once it gets into your blood, it is hard to imagine living anywhere else." He paused. "I came out here 5 years ago from Pennsylvania. Thought I would work for a season, save some money, and head back east. But the land has a way of holding on to you." "You like working at the Double Creek Ranch?" Jane asked, genuinely curious. A smile crossed Thomas's face, transforming it from merely handsome to genuinely striking. "I do. The owner, Mr. Carson, is a fair man who treats his workers well. The work is hard but honest. I have learned more in 5 years out here than I learned in 20 years back east. How to read the weather, how to handle cattle, how to survive when things go wrong." He gestured at his bandaged side. "Though apparently I still have more to learn about watching for prairie dog holes." Jane found herself smiling back. "At least you did not break anything when you fell." "True enough. Could have been much worse." He met her eyes directly, and she felt a jolt of something she could not quite name run through her. "You were kind to help me when you did not have to. I will not forget that." Before she could respond, Murphy called down from his perch that they were approaching a creek where they would stop briefly to water the horses. The stagecoach rolled to a halt beside a narrow stream lined with cottonwood trees, and everyone climbed out to stretch their legs. Thomas immediately went to check on his horse, which had been following gamely behind the coach despite its injury. Jane watched him run gentle hands over the animal, murmuring words of encouragement, and felt that strange tightening in her chest again. She walked a short distance away to stretch her legs and splash some cool water on her face. The evening air was beginning to cool, bringing relief from the heat of the day. She could hear crickets beginning their nightly chorus and the soft rustle of wind through the cottonwood leaves. It was peaceful in a way that made her think she could understand why Thomas said the land got into your blood. "You should be careful," a voice said behind her, and she turned to find Thomas standing a few feet away. He had removed his hat, and she could see his hair was darker than she had thought, almost black. Creek beds like this attract all sorts of wildlife, snakes mostly this time of evening. Jane took an involuntary step backward. Snakes? Most likely just water snakes, nothing too dangerous. But it pays to be cautious. He moved closer, his eyes scanning the ground around them. "You will need to learn to watch your step out here. The land is beautiful, but it does not forgive carelessness." "I am beginning to understand that," Jane said softly. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not just a handsome face, but something deeper. There was a quietness to him, a stillness that suggested someone who spent time alone with his thoughts. But there was also a warmth in his eyes when he looked at her that made her feel seen in a way Harold Peterson's carefully written letters never had. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said suddenly, as if the words had escaped before he could stop them. "Why did you really agree to come out here and marry a stranger? You seem like someone who could have had other options." Jane stiffened slightly, defensive. "You do not know anything about my situation or what options I had." "You are right," he said immediately, holding up a hand. "I apologize. That was presumptuous of me." She could have left it at that, could have walked away and maintained her dignity, but something made her want him to understand. "My father owned a shipping company in Boston, not a large one, but successful enough that we lived comfortably. Then 3 years ago, one of his ships sank in a storm. He had borrowed heavily to finance that voyage, and when it was lost, the debts became overwhelming. We lost our house, our savings, everything. My mother took in sewing to help pay for a tiny apartment. My younger sister went to work in a factory." She swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. "I had been engaged to someone before the money disappeared. He broke things off within a week of learning my father was ruined. So yes, I could have stayed in Boston. I could have worked in factories or taken in laundry or any number of things poor women do to survive. But when Mr. Peterson's advertisement appeared in the newspaper, offering marriage and security, it seemed like a chance to build something better. Maybe that makes me mercenary. Maybe it makes me practical. I am not sure I know the difference anymore. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "It does not make you mercenary," he said finally. "It makes you brave, coming all this way into unknown territory to start a new life that takes courage." He paused. "Though if you do not mind me saying so, marrying for security alone seems like a hard way to live." "And what would you suggest I marry for?" Jane asked, hearing the edge in her own voice. "Love. That is a luxury I cannot afford." "Maybe," Thomas said quietly. "But maybe it is something you deserve anyway." The air between them felt suddenly charged, and Jane did not know what to say. She was saved from having to respond by Murphy's call that they were moving on. They walked back to the stagecoach in silence, and this time when they climbed inside, Jane was acutely aware of every inch of space between them, every accidental brush of shoulders as the coach jolted over rough patches in the road. As twilight deepened into night, the whiskey salesman fell asleep again, his snores filling the small space. Jane tried to doze as well, but her mind was too full of conflicting thoughts and feelings. She kept thinking about Thomas's words, about the way he had looked at her by the creek, about how different he was from the formal, distant tone of Harold Peterson's letters. She told herself it meant nothing. Thomas was a kind man who had shown her some sympathy, nothing more. She was tired and anxious about meeting her future husband, and she was reading too much into a simple conversation. But when the stagecoach hit a particularly deep rut, and she was thrown sideways, it was Thomas's arm that steadied her, his hand warm and solid on her shoulder. Their faces were suddenly very close in the darkness, close enough that she could feel his breath on her cheek and see the way his pupils had dilated. For a heartbeat, she thought he might kiss her, and more terrifying was the realization that she wanted him to. Then the moment passed. Thomas released her shoulder and moved slightly away, putting a careful distance between them. Jane pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart racing beneath her palm. This was wrong. She was promised to another man. In less than an hour, she would be in Laramie, meeting Harold Peterson for the first time. She had no right to these feelings, no right to notice the way Thomas's presence made her feel more alive than she had felt in years. The lights of Laramie appeared on the horizon like a scattering of stars. As they drew closer, Jane could make out the shapes of buildings lining a main street, could hear the faint sounds of piano music and voices carrying on the night air. The town was larger than she had expected, sprawling and busy, even at this late hour. The stagecoach rolled down the main street, passing storefronts and saloons and a large hotel with a covered porch. Murphy pulled the stagecoach to a stop in front of the station, a sturdy building with a corral attached to one side. As Jane climbed out on shaky legs, she saw a man step forward from where he had been waiting on the station porch. He was tall and thin, dressed in a neat dark suit, with silver-gray hair and a carefully trimmed beard. His face was angular and stern, the face of a man used to being obeyed. "Miss Garrett?" he asked, and his voice matched his appearance, formal and controlled. "Yes," Jane managed, her mouth suddenly dry. "Mr. Peterson, indeed." He looked her up and down in a way that made her feel like a piece of merchandise being evaluated for purchase. "You are younger than I expected from your letters. That is good. You will have many years ahead of you." He did not smile, did not offer any word of welcome beyond those clinical observations. Jane felt her stomach sink. In her imagination, she had hoped that Harold Peterson might be warmer in person than he had been in his letters, that meeting face to face might spark some connection between them. But the man before her seemed even more remote than his written words had suggested, his eyes cold and assessing. Thomas had climbed down from the coach and was helping Murphy untie his horse. Jane saw Harold's gaze flick toward him with a frown. "I trust the journey was not too taxing," Harold said to Jane, though his attention was still partly on Thomas. "I have made arrangements for you to stay at the hotel tonight. We will be married tomorrow morning at the church, and then I will show you to your new home." "Tomorrow," Jane repeated, startled. "So soon?" "I see no reason to delay," Harold said with a slight edge to his voice. "You came here to marry me, did you not? The sooner we formalize the arrangement, the sooner you can begin learning how I prefer my household to be run." The words sent a chill through Jane. Learning how he preferred his household to be run. Not building a life together, not getting to know one another, just learning his preferences, his rules. She glanced toward Thomas and found him watching the exchange with a troubled expression. "Your trunk will be delivered to the hotel," Harold continued. "I will collect you at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Do not be late. I have a business to run and cannot afford to waste time on lengthy ceremonies." With that, he nodded curtly and turned to walk away, apparently expecting her to follow. Jane stood frozen for a moment, watching his retreating back. This was what she had traveled 2,000 miles for, this cold, imperious man who looked at her like a possession he had ordered from a catalog. She felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. She had known this would not be a love match. She had prepared herself for a practical arrangement, but somehow the reality of it was so much worse than she had imagined. "Miss Garrett," Thomas's voice was soft beside her. "Are you all right?" She turned to face him and saw genuine concern in his eyes. "I am fine," she lied. "Just tired from the journey." Thomas glanced in the direction Harold had gone, then back at her. "That man is not what you expected, is he?" Jane wanted to deny it to maintain her dignity, but she found she could not lie to him. "No," she whispered. "He is not." "Then do not marry him," Thomas said, and the intensity in his voice made her breath catch. "You do not have to go through with this, Jane. You do not owe him anything just because you came all this way." It was the first time he had used her given name, and hearing it on his lips sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. "What choice do I have?" she asked. "I have no money, no way to get back to Boston even if I wanted to. At least Mr. Peterson can offer me security." "Security is not the same as happiness," Thomas said. He reached out as if to take her hand, then seemed to think better of it and let his arm drop. "Listen, I know I have no right to say any of this. We only met a few hours ago. But in those few hours, I have seen more real kindness and courage in you than I have seen in most people I have known for years. You deserve better than a man who looks at you like you are a piece of property he has purchased." "And what do I deserve?" Jane asked, her voice breaking slightly despite her best efforts to control it. "What options do you think I have?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Jane could see him wrestling with something internal, some decision he was trying to make. Finally, he spoke, and his words came out rough and earnest. "Choose me instead." Jane stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What?" "Choose me," Thomas repeated, taking a step closer. "I know I do not have much. I am just a ranch hand with some savings and a rented room. But I have a steady job and I work hard, and I would treat you with the respect and care you deserve. I cannot offer you a big house or fancy dresses right now, but I can promise you that I would never look at you the way that man just did, like you are something to be managed rather than someone to be cherished." "You are serious," Jane breathed, trying to process what he was saying. "You are actually serious." "I know it sounds crazy," Thomas said. "We barely know each other, but sometimes you just know when something is right, do you not?" When I was sitting beside you in that stagecoach, watching you care for a stranger's wound without being asked, listening to you talk about why you came here, something just clicked into place for me. I felt like I had been waiting to meet you without even knowing I was waiting." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I am not good with words like this. What I am trying to say is that I think I could fall in love with you, given the chance, and I think maybe you could fall in love with me too. Is that not worth more than security with a man who makes you look like you want to run away?" Jane's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Every practical instinct she had was screaming that this was madness. She had known Thomas for mere hours. She knew nothing about him beyond what they had shared in brief conversations. He was right that he could offer her very little in material terms. Choosing him would be choosing uncertainty, choosing to trust in something as insubstantial as a feeling. But oh, what a feeling it was. Standing here looking into his earnest face, seeing the hope and vulnerability in his eyes, she felt more alive than she had in the 3 years since her world had fallen apart. Harold Peterson offered her safety, but safety felt hollow when it came without warmth or joy or the possibility of genuine connection. "I do not know what to say," she admitted. "This is all happening so fast." "I know," Thomas said, "and I am not asking you to marry me right this second. I am just asking you to give me a chance before you commit yourself to a man who will never make you happy. Stay in town for a few days. Get to know me. Let me show you what life could be like if you chose differently. If at the end of that time you still want to marry Harold Peterson, I will step aside. But at least give yourself the chance to make a real choice instead of just accepting the only option you thought you had." Jane looked toward the hotel where Harold expected her to wait docilely for tomorrow's wedding, then back at Thomas with his bandaged side and dusty clothes and eyes full of something that looked remarkably like hope. Every sensible part of her knew she should thank him politely, tell him she could not possibly take such a risk and proceed with the plan she had come here to execute. Instead, she heard herself say, "All right." Thomas's entire face transformed with his smile. "All right, you mean it." "I must be insane," Jane said, feeling a slightly hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat. "But yes, I mean it. I will give you a few days. I will get to know you before I make my final decision, though I have no idea how I am going to explain this to Mr. Peterson." "Do you want me to come with you?" Thomas asked. Jane shook her head. "No, I should do this myself. He deserves to hear it from me directly." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Will you wait here? I am not going anywhere," Thomas promised. Jane walked toward the hotel with her legs trembling beneath her skirts. Harold had already gone inside, presumably to confirm her reservation. She found him at the front desk, speaking with the clerk in a tone that managed to be both quiet and authoritative. When he saw her approach, his expression shifted to something that might have been annoyance. "I thought I told you to follow me," he said. "I do not appreciate having to wait around when I have other matters to attend to." Jane forced herself to meet his eyes directly. "Mr. Peterson, I need to speak with you." "It can wait until tomorrow," he replied dismissively. "You must be tired after your journey. Get some rest and we will discuss whatever household matters concern you after the wedding." "No," Jane said, and the word came out more firmly than she had intended. "It cannot wait. I need to speak with you now." Harold's eyes narrowed. "Very well. We can use the hotel parlor." He led her to a small sitting room off the main lobby and closed the door behind them. "What is this about, Miss Garrett? I do not appreciate dramatics." "I am not being dramatic," Jane said, clasping her hands together to stop them from shaking. "I am being honest. Mr. Peterson, I came here intending to marry you, but I have realized I cannot go through with it. I am sorry for the inconvenience and any embarrassment this may cause you, but I cannot marry a man I do not know and who has given me no indication that he cares to know me." Harold's face flushed red. "Cannot go through with it. We had an agreement, Miss Garrett. I paid for your passage from Boston. I have made arrangements, told people I was taking a wife. You cannot simply change your mind on a whim." "I understand you are angry," Jane said, trying to keep her voice steady. "And I am sorry, but I did not sign any legal contract. Our agreement was made through letters, and I have the right to reconsider before any vows are spoken." "This is about that ranch hand, is it not?" Harold said, and his voice dripped with contempt. "I saw you talking to him outside. What did he tell you? Did he promise you some romantic fantasy?" "This is not about him," Jane insisted, though she knew it was at least partly a lie. "This is about the fact that when you looked at me tonight, you did not see a person. You saw someone to manage your household and follow your rules. That is not the kind of marriage I want." "And what kind of marriage do you want?" Harold asked coldly. "Do you think love and romance are enough to build a life on? I can offer you stability, status, a comfortable home. What can a ranch hand offer you? A tiny room and hard work for the rest of your life, maybe," Jane said quietly. "But at least it would be a life I chose freely, not one I accepted because I was desperate and scared." Harold stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him struggling to control his temper. "You are making a tremendous mistake," he said finally. "When reality sets in, and you realize that pretty words do not pay for food or shelter, do not come crawling back to me. I will not be made a fool of twice." "I understand," Jane said, "and I truly am sorry." She left the parlor before he could say anything else, her heart pounding so hard she felt dizzy. As she stepped back out onto the hotel porch, she saw Thomas still waiting where she had left him, holding the reins of his injured horse. When he saw her face, he straightened. "How did he take it?" Thomas asked. "About as well as could be expected," Jane replied. "He thinks I am making a terrible mistake." "Do you think you are making a terrible mistake?" Jane looked at him, really looked at him, this man who had appeared in her life only hours ago and somehow managed to turn everything upside down. "I think I might be," she said honestly. "But for the first time in a very long time, I also think I might be doing something right." Thomas's answering smile was like sunrise. "Come on," he said. "Let me show you Laramie, and then we should probably find somewhere for you to stay that is not the hotel where your former intended is staying." "I do not have much money," Jane admitted. Mr. Peterson was going to pay for the hotel. "I have enough in my savings for a few nights at a boarding house," Thomas said. "Mrs. Fletcher runs a respectable place on the edge of town. She will take good care of you, and it will give you a place to stay while you figure out what comes next." As they walked through the streets of Laramie, Thomas leading his limping horse, and Jane carrying her small traveling bag that Murphy had retrieved from the coach, she felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. She had just thrown away the security she had traveled 2,000 miles to find. She had placed her trust in a man she barely knew. By all rational measures, she was being spectacularly foolish. But when Thomas smiled at her in the lamplight spilling from a saloon window, when he pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the town, when his hand accidentally brushed hers and neither of them pulled away, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt hopeful. Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house was a neat, two-story building painted white with blue shutters. The proprietress herself answered Thomas's knock, a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a sensible bun. Thomas explained that Jane needed a room for a few days, and Mrs. Fletcher looked between them with an expression that suggested she was sizing up the situation and making rapid calculations about propriety and respectability. "You are not married?" she asked bluntly. "No, madam," Thomas said. "Miss Garrett just arrived in town tonight. She needs a safe place to stay while she decides what to do next." Mrs. Fletcher's eyes softened slightly. "Running from something, dear. Running towards something, I hope," Jane replied, and the older woman smiled. "All right, then. I have a room on the second floor, clean and comfortable. $3 for the week, meals included. But I run a respectable house, young man," she added, fixing Thomas with a stern look, "which means no gentlemen callers in the rooms." "Understood, madam," Thomas said seriously. "I will be a perfect gentleman. See that you are, Mrs. Fletcher said, but there was a twinkle in her eye that suggested she was not quite as fierce as she pretended. The room she showed Jane to was small but spotlessly clean, with a narrow bed covered in a cheerful quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a window that looked out over the street. After Mrs. Fletcher left them alone, Jane sat down on the bed and suddenly felt the weight of everything that had happened crash over her. She had been traveling for days with very little sleep. She had just broken off an engagement before it had even properly begun. She had agreed to get to know a man she had only just met. Her entire future had become uncertain in the span of a few hours. Thomas must have seen something in her face because he knelt down in front of her, his hands resting gently on her knees. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "I am terrified," Jane admitted. "What have I just done?" "You made a choice," Thomas said. "A brave choice. And I promise you, Jane, I am going to do everything in my power to make sure you do not regret it." Looking into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there, Jane felt some of her panic subside. She reached out and touched his face, letting her fingers trace the line of his jaw. He closed his eyes at the contact, and she felt him tremble slightly beneath her touch. "I should go," he said, though he did not move. "It is late and you need rest. But I will come back tomorrow morning and we can spend the day together. I will show you the ranch, introduce you to some people, help you start to see what a life here could be like." "All right," Jane said softly. Thomas stood, and she immediately missed his closeness. He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression that made her heart skip. "I am glad you chose to give me a chance," he said. "I know I do not deserve it yet, but I will earn it. I promise you that." After he left, Jane changed into her nightgown and climbed into bed, but sleep would not come. Her mind kept replaying the events of the day, from the moment Thomas's horse had appeared in the road to the look on Harold Peterson's face when she broke their engagement. She thought about Thomas's words by the creek, the way he had looked at her in the stagecoach, the gentleness in his hands when he touched his injured horse. She had come west looking for security and found something entirely different. She had found possibility. The next morning, Jane woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the sounds of Laramie coming to life outside. She could hear wagons rattling past, voices calling greetings, the distant lowing of cattle. She dressed carefully in her best day dress, a soft blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and pinned her dark hair up in a style that was neat but not severe. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she saw someone different from the tired, anxious woman who had arrived in town last night. This woman looked alert and alive, her cheeks flushed with something that might have been excitement. Mrs. Fletcher served breakfast in a cheerful dining room on the first floor. There were two other boarders, both men who worked at the rail yard, and they nodded politely to Jane before focusing on their meals. Mrs. Fletcher fussed over Jane like a mother hen, piling her plate with eggs and bacon and fresh bread with butter. "You eat up, dear," she said. "You look like you could use some meat on your bones. And I suspect you have a big day ahead of you if that handsome cowboy who brought you here last night has anything to say about it." Jane felt herself blushing. "He is just a friend." Hum. Mrs. Fletcher said with a knowing smile. Friends do not look at each other the way you two were looking at each other, but that is none of my business. She paused, her expression becoming more serious. Just be careful, dear. The West can be a hard place for women without protection. Make sure you know what you are getting into before you make any permanent decisions. I will, Jane promised, touched by the older woman's concern. Thomas arrived just as Jane was finishing her breakfast. He had cleaned up since last night, his hair still damp from washing and his clothes fresh though clearly well worn. He carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that looked like he had picked them himself, and he presented them to Jane with an expression that was equal parts shy and hopeful. I thought you might like these, he said. They grow all over the prairie this time of year. Jane took the flowers, feeling absurdly pleased by the simple gesture. They are beautiful, thank you, Mrs. Fletcher produced a jar to use as a vase, and once the flowers were arranged to her satisfaction, Jane followed Thomas outside into the bright Wyoming morning. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of sage and distant pine. Thomas's horse, which he had left at a local stable overnight, was waiting saddled and ready. I borrowed a wagon from the ranch, Thomas explained, gesturing to a sturdy buckboard tied nearby. Thought it would be more comfortable than riding double, and it will give us a chance to talk on the way out to Double Creek. The drive out of town took them through countryside that grew progressively more beautiful as they left the settled area behind. The road followed a creek lined with cottonwoods, and beyond that the land rolled away in waves of grass, dotted with wildflowers. Thomas pointed out landmarks as they went. A rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear, a meadow where elk sometimes grazed in the early morning, a stand of aspen trees that he said turned brilliant gold in the fall. It is not Boston, he said at one point, glancing at her to gauge her reaction. No theaters or fine restaurants or fancy shops. Some people find it too lonely out here, too empty. I do not think I am one of those people, Jane replied. She was discovering that the vastness she had found intimidating yesterday now felt liberating. There was something about the open space that made her feel like she could breathe properly for the first time in years. I think I could love it here. Thomas's smile was answer enough. They reached the Double Creek Ranch in late morning. It was larger than Jane had expected, with a main house, several barns and outbuildings, and extensive corrals. Cattle dotted the landscape in the distance, watched over by riders on horseback. Thomas drove the wagon to the main house and helped Jane down. A man emerged from the house as they approached. He was in his 50s, with a weathered face and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He looked at Jane with frank curiosity before turning to Thomas. Heard you had some trouble yesterday, he said. How is Duke? He will recover thanks to the local vet, Thomas replied. Mr. Carson, I would like you to meet Miss Jane Garrett. Jane, this is Samuel Carson, owner of Double Creek and the best boss a man could ask for. Samuel Carson tipped his hat to Jane. Pleased to meet you, miss, though I will admit to being curious what brings a lady like yourself out to a dusty cattle ranch. Thomas invited me, Jane said simply. He wanted to show me what his life here is like. Something shifted in Samuel Carson's expression, and he looked between them with dawning understanding. I see. Well then, let me give you the grand tour. Thomas, you come along too. You can help me explain what we do around here. For the next several hours, Jane got a comprehensive introduction to ranch life. Samuel showed her the cattle operation, explained how they managed the herd through different seasons, and introduced her to several of the other ranch hands who were working near the main compound. Everyone she met treated her with courtesy, and seemed to regard Thomas with genuine respect and friendship. Thomas himself was transformed here. In town, he had been somewhat reserved, careful in his words and actions. Here on the ranch, he was confident and capable, moving with easy grace through tasks that would have baffled Jane completely. She watched him work with a young horse that was being trained to accept a saddle, his hands patient and his voice calm and reassuring. The horse responded to him with trust, and Jane found herself thinking that Thomas would be the same with people, the same with a wife, patient, kind, worthy of trust. At midday, they ate lunch in the ranch cookhouse with the other hands. The food was simple but plentiful, and the conversation flowed easily, full of good-natured teasing and stories about cattle and weather and local events. Jane found herself laughing more than she had in months, caught up in the camaraderie and warmth. These were good people, honest people who worked hard and looked after one another. It was so different from the formal, competitive world she had left behind in Boston, where social status and appearances mattered more than genuine connection. After lunch, Thomas took her on a walk along the creek that gave the ranch its name. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, and willows trailed their branches into the current. They found a spot in the shade and sat down, Jane spreading her skirts carefully to avoid the damp grass. "What do you think?" Thomas asked. "Too rustic for a city girl." "I was not really a city girl," Jane replied. "I mean, I lived in Boston, but my family was not part of high society. We were comfortable middle class, and when we lost everything, that world closed its doors to us very quickly. I learned that fancy addresses and proper manners do not mean much when people are only interested in what you can do for them." She plucked a blade of grass and twisted it between her fingers. "What you have here, what Mr. Carson has built, it feels more real to me than anything I left behind. These people respect you for what you do and who you are, not for how much money you have or what family you come from." "That is true," Thomas agreed. "Out here, a man is judged by his work and his word. I like that. I like knowing that if I work hard and treat people fairly, that matters more than where I came from or who my parents were." He paused. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Yes," Jane said. "When you worked at that hospital in Boston after your father lost his money, did you like the work? Or was it just something you had to do to survive?" Jane considered the question carefully. "Both, I suppose. At first it was terrifying. I had never seen such suffering up close, such terrible injuries and illnesses. But as time went on, I discovered I was good at it. I had steady hands and a calm temperament, and patients seemed to respond well to me. There was satisfaction in helping someone, in easing pain or fear even when I could not cure the underlying problem." She looked at him. "Why do you ask?" "Because there is not a proper doctor in Laramie," Thomas said. "Doc Henderson does his best, but he is really more of a veterinarian who treats humans when necessary. The town could use someone with real medical training. I was just thinking that if you decided to stay here, you might be able to use those skills you learned. Maybe not right away, but eventually. It could be a way for you to contribute, to have something of your own beyond just keeping house." Jane felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun overhead. The fact that Thomas had thought about this, had considered not just how she might fit into his life, but how she might build a life of her own, meant more than he probably realized. Harold Peterson had talked about her learning to run his household according to his preferences. Thomas was talking about her having skills and purpose beyond serving his needs. "You really mean that?" she said softly. "You would not mind having a wife who worked outside the home?" "Why would I mind?" Thomas asked, looking genuinely puzzled. "If you have skills that could help people and you want to use them, it would be selfish of me to stop you. A marriage should be a partnership, should it not? Both people supporting each other, helping each other become the best versions of themselves. I think so, Jane said. But not every man sees it that way. Then not every man deserves a woman like you, Thomas replied. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the creek and the sound of wind in the grass. Jane felt a contentment settling over her that was entirely new. She was still acutely aware that she had known Thomas for less than 24 hours, that agreeing to court him was a gamble that could end badly. But with every hour they spent together, she felt more certain that this was not a mistake. This felt right in a way that nothing had felt right in years. "Can I tell you something?" Thomas said eventually. "When I first came out west, I was running from something. There was a girl back in Pennsylvania, someone I thought I loved. She married someone else, someone with better prospects, and it broke something in me. I told myself I was coming out here for adventure, for opportunity, but really I was just trying to get far enough away that it would not hurt anymore." "And did it work?" Jane asked gently. "Eventually," Thomas said. "The work helped. The land helped. Waking up every morning to something bigger than my own small problems helped. After a while, I realized I had not thought about her in weeks, and when I did think about her, it did not hurt anymore. It was just something that had happened, something I had survived." He turned to look at Jane directly. "What I am trying to say is that I understand running from pain, but I also learned that running is not the same as healing. You only really heal when you find something worth running toward instead." "And what did you find worth running toward?" Jane asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "This," Thomas said, gesturing at the landscape around them. "This place, this life. Good work and good people and enough space to breathe." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle around hers. "And now maybe you," Jane's breath caught. "Thomas, we have only just met." "I know," he said, "and I am not asking you to promise me anything right now. But I want you to know that what I feel when I look at you, it is not just attraction or loneliness or anything that's simple. It is recognition. Like I've been waiting for you without knowing I was waiting, and now that you are here, everything makes sense in a way it did not before." Jane squeezed his hand. "I feel it too," she admitted, "and it terrifies me because it is so fast, so unexpected, but I cannot deny it is there." Thomas lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was old-fashioned and courtly, and it made Jane's heart flutter in her chest. When he lowered her hand again, he did not let go, and they sat there beside the creek with their fingers intertwined, not speaking, just being together in a moment that felt both infinite and impossibly fragile. The afternoon wore on, and eventually they returned to the wagon for the drive back to town. As they approached Laramie, Jane felt reality beginning to intrude on the perfect bubble of the day they had shared. She still had no clear plan for her future. She was staying in a boarding house with limited funds and no source of income. She had alienated the man who had offered her security, and she was putting her faith in a cowboy who made her heart race, but who could not guarantee her anything beyond his own sincere intentions. As if reading her thoughts, Thomas said, "I have been thinking about the practical aspects of this situation." "And?" Jane asked. "And I think the first thing is for you to stay at Mrs. Fletcher's for at least a week or two while we continue getting to know each other. That is respectable and gives you time to make a real decision about what you want." He paused. "I also think you should talk to Doc Henderson. Even if he is not a proper doctor, he might know of families who need help with sick relatives or children. You could start building a reputation for your skills, earn a little money of your own." "That is good thinking," Jane said, grateful for his practical nature. "As for me," Thomas continued, "I have been saving money for a while now, thinking eventually I might want to buy some land of my own, start a small ranch. I have enough put by to support a wife, at least modestly, if that is something you decided you wanted." He glanced at her. "I know I cannot offer you luxury. The life of a ranch hand's wife would be simple, but it would be honest, and you would never want for food or shelter or respect." "Those things matter more than luxury," Jane said quietly. They arrived back at the boarding house as the sun was beginning to set. Thomas walked Jane to the door, and they stood on the porch for a moment, neither quite ready to say goodbye. "Thank you for today," Jane said, "for showing me your world, for being honest with me about what a life together might look like." "Thank you for giving me the chance," Thomas replied. "Will you have dinner with me tomorrow evening? There is a decent restaurant in town, nothing fancy but good food." "I would like that," Jane said. Thomas hesitated, then reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, and Jane found herself leaning into the touch. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, and her lips parted in anticipation. But instead he dropped his hand and stepped back. "I should go," he said, his voice slightly rough. "I want to do this right, Jane. I want to court you properly, give you time to be sure. Even though every instinct I have is telling me to pull you into my arms and never let go." Jane felt heat flood through her at his words. "I understand," she managed. "I want that too. Both things, I mean." "The time to be sure, and—" She trailed off, suddenly shy. Thomas smiled, and it was a smile full of promise. "Good night, Jane." "Good night, Thomas." She watched him walk away into the gathering dusk, and only then did she realize she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. She went inside to find Mrs. Fletcher waiting in the front parlor with a knowing expression. "Good day?" the older woman asked. "Very good," Jane replied. "He is a good man, that Thomas Sullivan," Mrs. Fletcher said. "Known him for a few years now, since he first came to work at Double Creek. Never caused any trouble, always polite, helps folks when they need it. You could do worse." "I could," Jane agreed. "Though I suppose I could also do better, at least in material terms. He is just a ranch hand." "Just a ranch hand," Mrs. Fletcher repeated, shaking her head. "Dear girl out here, an honest man who works hard and treats people right is worth more than all the money in the world. You remember that." Over the next week, Jane fell into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. She spent her mornings helping Mrs. Fletcher around the boarding house, insisting on earning her keep rather than simply paying for her room. The older woman was grateful for the assistance and showed Jane how to make bread and preserve vegetables and do the 1,000 small tasks that kept a household running. In the afternoons, Jane either spent time with Thomas or explored Laramie on her own. The town was rough around the edges but vibrant with life. She met shopkeepers and their wives, families who had come west looking for opportunity just as she had. She learned that Laramie was a relatively new town, having grown rapidly since the railroad came through 14 years earlier in 1868. The population was a mix of railroad workers, ranchers, miners, and people who served those industries. It was not refined or cultured in the way Boston had been, but there was an energy to it that Jane found appealing. Thomas took her to dinner as promised, and then again 2 nights later. They went on long walks through town and out into the surrounding countryside. They talked about everything: their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Jane learned that Thomas's father had been a stern man who expected his sons to follow him into the coal mines and who had been furious when Thomas chose a different path. Thomas learned about Jane's younger sister Emma, who was still in Boston and whom Jane worried about constantly. He learned about Jane's love of reading, her complicated relationship with her mother who both resented and depended on her secret dream of maybe someday writing a book of her own. With every conversation, Jane felt the connection between them deepening. It was not just attraction, though there was plenty of that. It was not just loneliness or convenience. It was a genuine meeting of minds and hearts, a sense that they understood each other in fundamental ways. But there were also moments of doubt. Late at night, lying in her narrow bed at the boarding house, Jane would sometimes panic. Was she being a fool? Was she throwing away security for something that might not last? What if Thomas's feelings changed once the novelty wore off? What if she was making the same mistake her mother had always accused her of making, letting emotion override good sense? On the 8th day after her arrival in Laramie, Jane finally got up the courage to visit Doc Henderson. His office was above the general store, a cluttered room that smelled of antiseptic and tobacco smoke. The man himself was in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Help you, miss?" he asked when Jane knocked on his open door. "My name is Jane Garrett," she said. "I have some experience with medical work from a hospital in Boston. I was wondering if you might know of anyone in town who needs nursing care." Doc Henderson looked her up and down appraisingly. "Boston, eh? What brings you all the way out here?" Jane gave him the abbreviated version of her story, leaving out the more romantic details, but explaining that she needed to earn money while she decided her future. The doctor listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Well," he said when she finished, "as it happens, I do know of a situation that might suit you. Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, is recovering from a difficult childbirth. She has been weak and feverish, and her husband is frantic with worry. He has been trying to find someone to help care for her and the baby, but most women in town have their own families to look after. If you know anything about postnatal care, it might be just the thing." Relief flooded through Jane. "I do. I assisted with many births at the hospital and cared for new mothers afterward." "Good," Doc Henderson said. He wrote down an address on a scrap of paper and handed it to her. "Tell Mr. Abernathy I sent you, and if you do well with this, there will be other opportunities. The town is growing, and medical care is in short supply. I am getting too old to handle everything myself." Jane thanked him and left with the paper clutched in her hand and hope rising in her chest. This could be the beginning of building a real life here, a life that did not depend entirely on marrying someone for security. She found the Abernathy house easily, a neat frame building on a quiet street. Mr. Abernathy himself answered her knock, a tired-looking man in his 40s with worried eyes. When Jane explained why she was there, he nearly wept with relief. "Please," he said, ushering her inside. "My wife is upstairs. The baby is healthy, thank God, but Adelaide has been so weak. I am terrified I am going to lose her." Jane spent the next several hours examining Mrs. Abernathy, who was indeed feverish and weak, but not, Jane thought, in immediate danger. The problem seemed to be that she was not eating enough to regain her strength, and the constant demands of a newborn were preventing her from getting adequate rest. Jane prescribed a regimen of hearty broths, plenty of water, and scheduled times for the baby to be taken away so Mrs. Abernathy could sleep uninterrupted. "But who will feed the baby if I am sleeping?" Mrs. Abernathy asked weakly. "I will prepare bottles," Jane said firmly. "You need rest to recover, and the baby will be fine with supplemental feeding for a few weeks." Over the next several days, Jane essentially moved into the Abernathy household. She slept in a small guest room, waking every few hours to tend to the baby and check on Mrs. Abernathy. She prepared food, changed bandages, monitored the fever that slowly began to subside. Mr. Abernathy was pathetically grateful, and as Mrs. Abernathy began to improve, the woman herself became Jane's staunch ally. "You saved my life," she said one afternoon when Jane brought her lunch. I do not know how I can ever repay you." "You can tell other families who need help," Jane said. "I am trying to establish myself here, and word of mouth means everything." Mrs. Abernathy, it turned out, was friends with half the prominent families in Laramie. Within a week, Jane had 3 more offers of work: helping an elderly man recover from a broken leg, assisting at a difficult tooth extraction, and teaching a young mother how to care for a baby with colic. The pay was modest but steady, and more importantly, Jane was building a reputation as someone skilled and trustworthy. Through all of this, Thomas was a constant presence. He would stop by wherever Jane was working to check on her, sometimes bringing her food when she was too busy to prepare her own meals. He did not pressure her for answers about their future, did not demand that she make a decision about marriage. He simply showed up, day after day, proving through his actions that his feelings were not a momentary infatuation, but something deeper and more enduring. 3 weeks after Jane's arrival in Laramie, Samuel Carson invited both her and Thomas to dinner at the main ranch house. Jane was nervous as they drove out to Double Creek in Thomas's borrowed wagon. This felt like a significant step, like she was being formally evaluated by someone whose opinion mattered, but her nerves proved unnecessary. Samuel Carson and his wife Margaret were warm and welcoming, treating Jane like an honored guest. Over a dinner of roast beef and fresh vegetables from Margaret's garden, they talked about the ranch, about the town, and eventually about Jane's medical work. "Thomas tells me you have been doing quite well," Samuel said. "Half the town is singing your praises." Jane felt herself blushing. "I am just using skills I already had. There is such a need here for medical care." "There is," Margaret agreed, "and it is wonderful that you are filling that need. But what I want to know is what your intentions are toward our Thomas here." "Margaret," Samuel said with mild reproach, but his wife waved him off. "Someone has to ask the direct questions," she said. "These two have been dancing around each other for weeks. Thomas is like a son to us, and I want to make sure he is not getting his heart broken." Thomas looked mortified. "Mrs. Carson, you do not need to actually," Jane interrupted. "I think Mrs. Carson is right. We should talk about this directly." She took a deep breath and looked at Thomas. "I came here intending to marry for security, but what I found instead was the possibility of something more. These past few weeks getting to know you, seeing the life you have built, have been the happiest I have been in years. I think I am falling in love with you, Thomas Sullivan." "No, I know I am falling in love with you, and if you are still interested in marrying me, then my answer is yes." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas stared at her with an expression of such hope and joy that it took her breath away. Then he was moving, pushing back from the table and dropping to one knee beside her chair. "Jane Garrett," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know we have only known each other a few weeks. I know this has been fast and unconventional. But I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I love your kindness and your courage and your willingness to take a chance on something uncertain. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Jane said, and she was laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." Thomas pulled her into his arms, and this time there was no hesitation, no holding back. He kissed her deeply, thoroughly, and Jane kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of the past weeks. She heard Margaret sigh happily, and Samuel clear his throat in the background, but she did not care. All that mattered was this man, this moment, this perfect rightness of finding where she belonged. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I do not have a ring yet," he admitted, "but I promise I will get you one the best I can afford." "I do not need a ring," Jane said. "I just need you." But Samuel Carson cleared his throat again. If you are serious about this, we should discuss practical matters. Thomas, you have been talking about wanting to start your own place. I have been thinking about retiring in a few years, maybe dividing up some of the ranch land and selling parcels to my most trusted hands. I could let you have 100 acres on the eastern section, good grazing land with water rights to the creek. You could start small, build your own herd, and still work for me part-time until you get established. Thomas looked stunned. Mr. Carson, that is too generous. I do not know what to say. Say yes, Margaret told him with a smile. Samuel has been planning this for months. He just was not sure you were ready to settle down, but now that you have a wife, well, that changes things. Wife, Jane repeated, testing the word. That sounds strange and wonderful. It sounds perfect, Thomas said. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in town. Mrs. Fletcher helped Jane make a new dress from fabric Thomas insisted on buying, a soft cream-colored muslin with tiny blue flowers embroidered on the bodice. Margaret Carson lent Jane a veil that had belonged to her own mother. Doc Henderson gave Jane away since she had no family present, and Samuel Carson stood as Thomas's best man. The church was full despite the short notice. Jane had not realized how many friends she had made in her short time in Laramie until she saw all the faces smiling at her from the pews. The Abernathy family was there, along with several other families Jane had helped. Ranch hands from Double Creek filled the back rows. Even the whiskey salesman who had been on the stagecoach the day Jane arrived had shown up, grinning widely. The only person notably absent was Harold Peterson. Jane had seen him once on the street during her weeks in town, and he had looked through her as if she did not exist. She felt a moment of sadness for how things had ended between them, but it was a distant sadness, more regret for any pain she had caused than any doubt about her choices. As Jane walked down the aisle toward Thomas, who stood at the altar looking both nervous and radiantly happy in his best suit, she felt a sense of absolute certainty. This was right. This was what she had been meant to find when she stepped onto that stagecoach back in Boston. Not security with a stranger, but love with someone who saw her for who she truly was and valued her accordingly. The ceremony itself was simple and beautiful. They exchanged vows in front of God and their community, promising to love and honor each other through whatever challenges the future might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and told Thomas he could kiss his bride, the kiss was sweet and chaste but full of promise for what would come later, in private. The reception afterward was held at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house, which had become something of a second home to Jane. The older woman had outdone herself, preparing tables full of food and decorating the parlor with wildflowers and white ribbons. There was music and dancing, and more laughter than Jane had ever experienced at the formal, restrained social events she had attended in Boston. As the evening wore on and Jane danced with her new husband under the watchful but approving eyes of their friends, she thought about how strange and wonderful life could be. 6 weeks ago, she had been on a stagecoach heading toward a loveless marriage of convenience. A chance encounter with a man and his injured horse had changed everything, had opened up possibilities she never would have imagined. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, his arms warm around her as they swayed to the music. "About how lucky I am," Jane replied honestly. "About how one small moment can change your entire life." "I was thinking the same thing," Thomas said. "If my horse had not thrown that shoe exactly where he did, if the stagecoach had come along 10 minutes earlier or later, I never would have met you. Makes you believe in fate, does it not?" "Or just very good luck," Jane said with a smile. "Either way, I will take it," Thomas said, and kissed her there in front of everyone, not caring who saw. That night, after the guests had left and they had been seen off with much teasing and well-wishing, Thomas took Jane to the small cabin that had been prepared for them on the eastern section of Double Creek Ranch. It was modest, just 2 rooms and a loft, but Thomas had spent every spare moment of the past 2 weeks making it comfortable. There were curtains in the windows, a sturdy bed frame he had built himself, and even a small bookshelf in the corner for Jane's beloved books. "It is not much yet," Thomas said, suddenly nervous as he watched Jane look around. "But we can add on as we save money. Maybe a proper kitchen next year and eventually a room for—" He stopped, looking embarrassed. "A room for children," Jane finished softly. She turned to face him, and the love she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. "I think that sounds perfect." That night, they became husband and wife in every sense, and Jane discovered that the passion she had felt growing between them over the past weeks was only a fraction of what they could share. Thomas was gentle and patient, making sure she felt safe and cherished, and when they finally came together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like 2 pieces fitting together exactly as they were meant to. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his chest and his fingers trailing lazily through her hair, Jane felt a contentment so profound it almost frightened her. "I love you," she said into the darkness. "I know I said it before, but I need you to know how much I mean it. You saved me, Thomas, not just from a bad marriage, but from giving up on the idea that I could be happy." "You saved me too," Thomas replied, his voice rumbling in his chest beneath her ear. "I did not realize how lonely I was until you appeared. I had convinced myself that work and friendship were enough, that I did not need anything more. But you showed me what I was missing." They fell asleep tangled together, and when Jane woke in the early morning light streaming through the window, she felt Thomas's arm still around her and knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The months that followed were filled with hard work, but also with joy. Thomas continued working at Double Creek, while slowly building up his own small herd with cattle he purchased from Samuel Carson at a fair price. Jane continued her medical work, becoming increasingly indispensable to the families of Laramie. Together, they slowly improved their cabin, adding a proper kitchen and a second bedroom and even a small porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the prairie. Jane wrote long letters to her mother and sister in Boston, telling them about her new life. The responses were mixed. Her mother seemed unable to decide whether to be relieved that Jane had found security or scandalized that she had married a mere ranch hand. But Emma's letters were full of excitement and questions, and she begged Jane to send money for a train ticket so she could come visit and see this wild Western life for herself. Jane and Thomas saved carefully, and by the following spring, they were able to send for Emma. The sight of her younger sister stepping off the train in Laramie, looking both terrified and thrilled, brought tears to Jane's eyes. Emma was 19 now, still working in the factory but dreaming of something more. "It is so big here," Emma breathed, staring at the mountains in the distance. "And so empty." "Not empty," Jane corrected with a smile. "Full. Just full of different things than Boston was." Emma stayed for 3 months, and by the end of that time she had been thoroughly adopted by the community. She helped Jane with her medical work, showed a natural aptitude for nursing, and caught the eye of a young carpenter named Daniel Hayes, who was building new homes in Laramie's growing residential district. When Emma announced she had decided to stay in Wyoming permanently, Jane could hardly contain her happiness. The sisters worked together, eventually opening a small clinic in Laramie with Doc Henderson's blessing and assistance. The old doctor was ready to retire, and having Jane and Emma to take over most of his work gave him the freedom to do so. The clinic was not fancy, just 2 rooms in a building on Main Street, but it quickly became an essential part of the community. 2 years after their marriage, Jane gave birth to their first child, a healthy boy they named William. Thomas was beside himself with joy, cradling his son with a tenderness that made Jane fall in love with him all over again. She watched her husband teach their son to ride, to care for animals, to read the weather and the land, and she felt grateful every day for the choice she had made that long-ago evening in front of the Laramie train station. They had 3 more children over the following years. A daughter named Sarah, another son named Robert, and finally a daughter named Emma after Jane's sister, who by then had married her carpenter and had children of her own. The cabin was expanded multiple times, growing into a proper house with room for their growing family. Thomas's ranch thrived. He proved to have a gift for raising cattle, and his herd grew steadily. He earned a reputation as an honest dealer and a skilled stockman. Samuel Carson eventually did retire, and Thomas became one of the most respected ranchers in the territory. But success never changed him. He remained the same thoughtful, gentle man who had stopped his stagecoach for an injured horse and looked at a mail-order bride with eyes full of possibility. Years passed, and Wyoming became a state in 1890. Laramie continued to grow and change, becoming more settled and civilized but never losing the frontier spirit that had drawn so many people west. The clinic that Jane and Emma ran became a proper medical practice, treating everyone from railroad workers to ranchers to the Shoshone people from the nearby reservation. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Jane with a trip back to the spot where they had first really talked, the creek bed where he had warned her about snakes, and she had told him about her broken engagement in Boston. They sat on the same stretch of grass, older now and weathered by life, but still fundamentally the same people who had fallen in love there decades earlier. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked, taking her hand in his. "Choosing me instead of security with Harold Peterson?" Jane looked at him, at the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair, at the lines around his eyes from years of smiling and squinting into the sun, at the hands that were rough from work, but always gentle with her and their children. She thought about the life they had built together, the family they had created, the love that had only deepened with time. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "You gave me everything that mattered. You gave me love and partnership and the freedom to be myself. You gave me children and a home and a purpose. What could I possibly regret?" "I gave you a hard life," Thomas said. "Long winters and hot summers and work that never ends. I gave you calluses on your hands and worry lines on your face. And I would not trade any of it," Jane replied. "Do you know what I would have had with Harold Peterson? A comfortable house and nice dresses and a hollow existence with a man who saw me as property. You saw me as a partner, as an equal, as someone worthy of love and respect. That is worth more than all the security in the world." Thomas pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder the way she had on their wedding night so many years ago. "I love you, Jane Sullivan," he said. "More today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." "I love you too," Jane replied. "My cowboy who said choose me instead." They sat together as the sun set, painting the Wyoming sky in brilliant colors, and Jane thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. She had traveled west as a frightened young woman seeking security in a loveless marriage. She had found instead a soulmate, a partner, and a love that had sustained her through every challenge life had thrown at them. Their children were grown now, building lives of their own. William was running the ranch with his father, showing every sign of being as skilled a cattleman as Thomas. Sarah had married a schoolteacher and was living in Cheyenne, teaching children herself. Robert had joined the army, stationed at Fort Russell. And young Emma, named for her beloved aunt, was studying medicine back east, determined to become a real doctor and bring modern medical knowledge back to Wyoming. Jane and Thomas had built something lasting, something good. They had created a family, helped build a community, and shown through their example that love and partnership could triumph over practical concerns. They had proven that sometimes the best choice was not the safe one, but the one that made your heart sing. As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast Wyoming sky, Jane and Thomas walked hand in hand back to their house, back to the life they had built together. And in that moment, Jane knew with absolute certainty that she would make the same choice again in a heartbeat. She would always choose him. She would always choose love. She would always choose the cowboy who had looked at her with kind eyes and said, "Choose me instead." And she had, and it had made all the difference.